You are sitting with a book open in your lap, and your eyes are still moving across the page the way they always have, but something behind your eyes has quietly changed the way it uses what those eyes bring back, and you have no way of feeling that change from the inside. Here is the answer to the question in the title. Stated plainly, reading does nothing for your focus once the years pile up, unless you change how your brain predicts what's coming next on the page. Because the machinery that guesses ahead of your eyes is the actual site of the decline. Not attention itself, not memory itself, but the guessing. And here is why that answer isn't enough by itself. Knowing the guessing machine has slowed down tells you nothing about why two people who've read the exact same number of books for 40 years can end up in completely different places. One still able to hold an entire dinner conversation in his head at once, the other losing the thread of his own sentence before he finishes saying it. Something underneath the reading itself is doing the deciding, and it has almost nothing to do with how many pages get turned. Start with the belief itself, because it deserves to be taken seriously before it gets taken apart. Use it or lose it is not folk wisdom invented by a magazine. It's a genuine finding from cognitive aging research, and the general shape of it holds up. People who engage in cognitively demanding activity across their lives do show on average better outcomes on certain measures of processing speed and verbal fluency than people who don't. Reading is cognitively demanding. It requires holding a sentence's opening clause in mind long enough for the closing clause to complete it, tracking a character across 300 pages, reconstructing a world from nothing but sequences of black marks. If any activity should count as using it, reading should be near the top of the list. The advice to keep reading as you age isn't wrong. It's incomplete in a way that makes it almost useless past a certain point, and that's a very different kind of wrong. Here's where the impossible pair from the opening resolves, or at least starts to. Two brains, both fed the same volume of text for decades, arriving at different destinations that only makes sense if reading itself isn't the variable doing the work. Something about how each brain reads is the variable, and to find it you have to go somewhere almost nobody looks, not into memory, not into willpower, but into a process called predictive coding, and specifically into what happens to it as it ages. Predictive coding is a framework built largely from the work of neuroscientist Karl Friston, and its central claim is strange enough to sit with for a second. Your brain does not primarily process the world as it arrives. It predicts the world before it arrives, and then only pays close attention to the parts of incoming sensory information that violate the prediction. Everything that matches what was expected gets discounted, compressed, treated as already known. Everything that surprises the model gets amplified and pushed upward for further processing. This is not a minor detail of how perception works. Under this framework, it is perception. You are, at every waking moment, mostly seeing your own predictions and only lightly checking them against what's actually out there. Apply that to reading, and something uncomfortable falls out of it immediately. When you read a sentence, your brain isn't waiting passively for each word to arrive. It's actively predicting the next word, the next clause, sometimes the next several sentences, based on the statistical patterns of language you've absorbed across a lifetime of reading. A skilled, experienced reader's brain is extraordinarily good at this prediction, which sounds like an advantage, and for decades it is. But there's a hidden cost buried inside that skill, and it's the same cost that shows up anywhere a system gets very good at guessing. The better the prediction, the smaller the prediction error. And the smaller the prediction error, the less new signal actually reaches the parts of the brain responsible for staying sharp. This is where the cross-field collision matters, because this exact trade-off has a name outside of neuroscience entirely. In acoustics, engineers designing noise-canceling headphones face the identical problem in reverse. The headphone builds an internal model of the ambient noise around you, the drone of an airplane engine, the hum of an air conditioner, and generates an inverted waveform to cancel it out. The better that model gets, the quieter your world becomes. But push that same principle too far, and you don't just cancel noise, you cancel information. A perfectly predictive noise-canceling system would, in theory, cancel a voice calling your name if that voice happened to arrive at a frequency the model had learned to treat as background. Your brain's predictive machinery works the same way on a sentence. The better it's learned to predict what a paragraph is about to say, the more it quietly cancels the actual words in front of you, replacing them with its own expectation of what those words probably are. For most of your life, this isn't a problem. It's an efficiency gain. A 25-year-old reading a familiar genre skims past predictable sentences and slows down at genuine surprises, and that's exactly the trade you want. Attention spent where it's needed, conserved where it isn't. The trouble starts when the model gets so entrenched, so overtrained on a lifetime of familiar patterns that almost nothing left on the page counts as a surprise anymore. And that entrenchment, according to research on aging and predictive processing coming out of labs studying computational psychiatry, appears to increase with age. Not because older brains predict worse, but because they predict too well, too rigidly, too far in advance, leaving less and less room for the small jolts of prediction error that keep a reading brain actually engaged rather than gliding on autopilot. Here's a question worth sitting with, because it's the uncomfortable one underneath all of this. If your brain is mostly generating its own experience and only lightly checking it against the actual page, how much of what you call reading by 60 or 70 is really reading? And how much of it is your brain quietly reciting to itself what it already expected to find there? That question has a physical signature you can actually verify. And this is the recognition beat. So pay attention to your own experience for a moment. Have you ever reached the bottom of a page only to realize you cannot recall a single sentence from it, not because you were distracted by something else, but because your eyes were moving the entire time? That blank, slightly unsettling gap is not a memory failure in the way it feels like one. It's very likely your visual system executing its prediction so smoothly that almost nothing on that page generated enough surprise to register as an event worth keeping. You were technically reading. Almost nothing was technically happening. The eyes themselves carry a second piece of this story, and it's worth naming precisely rather than gesturing it vaguely. Reading isn't a smooth glide across a line of text. Your eyes move in rapid jumps called saccades, lasting roughly 20 to 40 milliseconds each, separated by fixations, brief pauses typically 200 to 250 milliseconds long, during which almost all the actual information extraction happens. Research using eye tracking in older adult readers has found fixation durations lengthening, and the size of the perceptual span, the window of text your visual system processes in a single fixation, narrowing somewhat with age. That alone would predict slower reading, which matches common experience. But slower isn't the same as less engaged, and here's where two separate declines get confused with each other constantly, in almost every piece of popular advice on this topic. A narrowing perceptual span is an oculomotor change. It lives in the machinery of the eye and the visual cortex mapping what the eye brings in. An overtrained prediction model is a completely different kind of change. It lives in how confidently the brain fills in what the eye hasn't even processed yet. Most advice about reading and aging treats these as the same problem and prescribes the same fix: read more. But you cannot fix an overconfident prediction model by feeding it more of exactly the material it has already mastered predicting. That's not exercise. That's rehearsal. Which raises the real question this video exists to answer, and it isn't, should you keep reading? It's what would actually count as prediction error for a brain that has gotten this good at guessing. Because whatever that answer turns out to be, it is very unlikely to look like another page of a familiar genre, in a familiar chair, at a familiar hour. There's a genuinely honest complication here, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than smoothed over. Some cognitive scientists are cautious about applying predictive coding as broadly as this, and they're right to be cautious. It's a powerful framework. But it's also a framework, not a settled fact carved into the brain's actual wiring. And researchers still disagree about exactly how much of perception it explains versus how much is doing other things entirely. What can be said with more confidence is narrower and less exciting than the whole theory. Reading material that resists easy prediction, an unfamiliar structure, an unfamiliar vocabulary, an author whose sentences don't resolve the way your genre-trained brain expects them to, produces measurably different patterns of engagement in older readers than material that confirms exactly what they expected. The theory explains why. The theory itself is still being argued over, sentence by sentence, in journals that will keep disagreeing about it for years. Let's follow the two threads of this all the way down, because there's a second layer to the story that most explanations of reading and aging skip entirely, and it isn't about eyes or prediction at all. It's about working memory, and specifically about something psychologist Alan Baddeley named the phonological loop back in the 1970s, the mechanism that holds a stream of words active in a kind of internal echo, silently, just long enough for the meaning of a sentence to assemble itself before the beginning fades. Reading a complex sentence requires holding its opening clause in that loop, while the closing clause arrives to complete it. Research on aging and working memory has found the effective capacity of that loop narrowing somewhat over the decades. Not collapsing, narrowing, meaning long syntactically complicated sentences increasingly outrun the loop's ability to hold them whole. A sentence with 3 embedded clauses that once assembled itself effortlessly now sometimes has to be reread from the top, the earlier clauses having quietly fallen out of the loop before the sentence resolved. Here is where the two threads, the prediction model and the working memory loop, actually converge, and it's a genuinely uncomfortable convergence. A well-trained prediction model compensates for a narrowing working memory loop by guessing the ending of the sentence before the loop even has to hold it, which sounds like a clean fix, almost elegant, but it means the sentence is being completed by expectation rather than by the words actually printed there. The system adapts to its own decline by leaning harder on the very habit that was already discounting the page. Compensation and impairments start reinforcing each other, quietly, and neither one alone would explain what's actually happening. You'd need both threads running at once to see why the whole system tips the way it does. If you've made it this far, there's a piece of this still ahead that reframes everything said so far, and it's stranger than the mechanism itself. It has to do with what predictive processing implies about who's actually doing the reading, and it's worth staying for. That's the kind of question this channel exists to sit inside rather than answer neatly, and it's coming. Before that, an honest correction, because a claim adjacent to this one gets repeated constantly and deserves to be cut down to size. You may have heard that the brain can't grow new neurons after a certain age, used as a kind of fatalistic explanation for cognitive decline in general. That claim is largely outdated. Neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons. In the adult human hippocampus has been documented well into old age in multiple studies, though the exact rate and how much it actually contributes to cognition remains genuinely disputed among neuroscientists studying it directly. The popular version of the claim is more pessimistic than the evidence supports. What's declining in this story isn't your capacity to grow new neural connections. It's something narrower and, in a strange way, more fixable. The balance between prediction and the error that's supposed to correct it. Here's the question underneath all of this, and it's the one this channel actually cares about, more than the mechanism itself. If most of what you experience while reading is your own brain's model of the page rather than the page itself, how much of your inner life, right now, not just while reading, is genuinely contact with the world outside you, and how much of it is a well-rehearsed simulation running just ahead of your senses, checked against reality only occasionally, only when something surprising enough breaks through? You have never once touched the world directly. You have only ever touched a model of it, updated by whatever prediction errors made it through. Reading simply makes that arrangement briefly visible, because a page is one of the few places where you can watch your own mind decide, sentence by sentence, what still counts as worth noticing. Tell me in the comments, has there been a book or even a single paragraph that stopped you completely, that you had to read twice not because you were distracted but because it refused to be predicted? I'd like to know what that felt like for you, because I suspect it's rarer than it used to be, and rarer than most people are willing to admit to themselves. There's no protocol at the end of this one, no 3-step fix, because the honest version of this answer doesn't resolve into a checklist. What can be said is only this: a brain that predicts too well isn't a brain that's failing. It's a brain that has finished learning in a sense, and finishing learning is not the same thing as staying alive to the world. Somewhere on your shelf tonight is a sentence built to defeat exactly that kind of finished mind. A sentence that doesn't end the way your prediction model assumes it will. Whether you go looking for it is a different question than the one this video was built to answer, and it isn't one I can answer for you. You are not the same reader you were 40 years ago, and neither is the page.